Thank you again for being here, and can I bring up Paul Westcott, who is the Executive Vice President of L2. He's been with the company for 8 years, and near and dear to my heart, he serves as the Vice President of the AAPC's Mid-Atlantic Chapter. Please welcome Paul Westcott.
Yes, I know. Data presentation, 9 a.m., the last day of the conference. Gotta love it. All right, well, thank you so much for coming out today, and thank you to Univision for pulling this all together. And what we've done is we took a look at the Hispanic electorate. We wanted to dive in and see really what it was broken down into, what 2020 looked like, and really what 2022 is going to look like. And so let's start, see if this works here. Sorry, oh, there we go. Boiling it down into a headline here, you have three big points. You've got higher turnout, younger turnout, and a ton of early voters showing up. Now, last year, early voting was enormous because of COVID, so you had a lot of changes in how people were actually showing up. In this case, Hispanics not only showed up, but they showed up in greater numbers in many cases than non-Hispanics. So we're going to show you some of those specific numbers in a second. Looking at some of the actual overall data here of the current electorate, in L2's national file, we are a national nonpartisan voter file company collecting these data from all 50 states and DC. And what you're seeing is 23.6 million individual Hispanic voters that we are coding as part of our file. We're getting that some cases from the voter file, and in many cases we are modeling it based on first name, middle name, last name, and then using some census data all wrapped into it, giving us what we believe is the most accurate look at the electorate. And what you can see here is this is a non-monolithic voting group. Nonpartisan, 28%, and of course you've got Democrat, 57%, 15% Republican. And the map you see on the side is based on, that's from our voter mapping tool, but what you can see in there is the red dots are Republican, blue is Democrat, so you see a very purple map throughout the country. You can see the growth in early voting and vote by mail, 5.5 million jumping to 11.9 million. The big number I like in this slide is it's stuck at 12% of overall early votes. That's impressive considering everybody showed up early, or a very large number of people in a number of states showed up early. So for that to hold solid was very impressive cycle over cycle. And then again, the 18 to 34-year-olds among the larger group. Then you've got massive increases in Hispanic turnout just overall from 12 million to 16 million in 2020. And one thing that's a little misleading there is 3-point turnout increase doesn't seem like much, but again, when you had a lot of people flooding into the electorate this cycle, all of a sudden seeing that kind of a jump, any kind of jump, is again impressive. And then 41%, 18 to 34-year-olds. First-time Hispanic voter growth, and this is something a lot of you, and we've all spoken about this, first-time new voters. How are we going to identify them? How are we going to find them? Well, looking at sort of Hispanic turnout, those 18 to 34-year-olds, Hispanic versus non-Hispanic, 58% over 50%, meaning that they voted and showed up for the first time. Very, very large and significant number. And so this is the kind of takeaway from the 2020 election overall. Growth in turnout, growth in youth turnout, early voting also went up among Hispanics, and first-time voters. Now, looking ahead to 2022, before I pull up the actual slide, I'll preface this by saying this is an L2 model. We did this based on voting performance, census data trends, and looking at a whole mishmash of a lot of other information, looking at population growth and making estimates. I'm going to say this is a very conservative model. We did this from 2016 looking toward 2020, and we actually came in a little under what the actual turnout was among Hispanic voters. So, with all that in mind, here's the numbers. Predicted 2022 Hispanic turnout in some key states. You can see there California, a potential growth of 45% cycle over cycle. Florida, 46%. Arizona, 67%. Texas, 28%. You look at this in some key areas and you see even some more dramatic changes. Look at Phoenix at 100% growth potentially. Again, a conservative model, and I believe we'll be coming back and looking at this and saying, well, yeah, probably fell short of what the actual turnout was going to be, but it gives you an idea of the growth that we're seeing here. And the overall turnout nationwide. So among those 23 some odd million voters, which is likely to grow over the next couple of years, or the next year and month or so, we are going to see around 14.3, or we expect 14.3 million turning out nationwide. The implications of this, really what it comes down to again is you've got a younger voting group that's turning out in larger numbers. And there was a slide that we didn't show in here, but there's a stat in here that basically talks about the youth of and longevity of Hispanics outpacing that of other ethnic groups. So you have younger and longer living voters overall, and then of course 27% of Hispanic voters in key battleground states are nonpartisan. So that's a group that both sides can attract and talk to. So we have that in there. And that is the presentation. All of the data you're going to get for the morning. Enjoy the panel. Thank you so much.
Is this on? It is on. Good morning again. I'm Lorena Chambers, CEO of Chambers Lopez Strategies, and as my guests join us here today, would like to make sure that you give them a very warm welcome for flying out and talking to us about these very important topics. So the first person here on my right is Matt Langston. And also know that on your app, you have a much longer bio for you can hear or learn more about each of these individuals. These are going to be very short introductions. So Matt Langston is from Big Dog Strategies. He's a general consultant who works mostly in Texas, but also in Oklahoma, California, among other states. He explained, we were talking a little bit earlier about some of the tactics that he likes to use and how he thinks about Latino voters. So we're going to be digging in a little bit with Matt on that. To his right, we have the incomparable Stephanie Valencia. Stephanie and I have been friends for many, many years. She has been a client and really is a social entrepreneur. She's a national leader at the nexus of politics, technology, and leadership. And she's one of the co-founders of Equis, which is one of the greatest, latest research firms focused on Latino voters. And next to her, we have the wonderful Sabrina Rodriguez. She is a national political reporter for Politico, and she's been with Politico for 6 years. I believe she's based in Miami and also Washington, so does a lot of trips. So please, a healthy round of applause for our guest. Thank you. So I want to thank you all for being here. Matt, I want you to be happier. There's water on the next to you also, so please be comfortable. The title of our panel here today is Busting Myths About Latino Voters. And I am going to date myself, but I've been doing this for decades with an S at the end. And I have run across a lot of myths and that unfortunately continue to this very day. Some of the ones, when I was writing these up this morning, seemed so simply extreme. And yet I said, you know what, I'm going to put it out there because they're not myths to me, but we want to make sure that we're here to help our folks understand. As consultants, they want to know how to do their jobs better and how to advise their clients. That's really what the role of the AAPC is. And so one of the first things, and I'm going to send this out to you, Sabrina. One of the major myths here is that Hispanic voters are Democrats, or in the inverse, their Hispanic voters are Republicans and they just don't know it yet. That's a Lionel Sosa line. Again, dating myself, but one of the great architects of Latino advertising on the Republican side. So we're going to open up wide, and I'd love for you to start off with your thoughts about that.
Well, I will, first of all, thank you everyone for being here this morning. I will start by saying, and this kind of sums it up to some extent, I'm Cuban American, and the stereotype is that all Cubans are Republicans. So right off the bat, all Latinos are not Democrats. That's the big stereotype. All Cubans are also not Republicans. I think when we're having this conversation, it's very easy. There's white voters, Latino voters, black voters, Asian American voters. How do we, box up all the groups neatly? And 2020 presented for many people a surprise that for those following this closely was not surprising. And it's the fact that Latinos vote differently because of socioeconomic standing, because of geography, because of the issues they're paying attention to, because of their ages, because of their country of origin. Are they first generation, third generation? I mean, there's no neat box when we're talking about Latinos. Cubans, for example, there are Cubans that have been here through the 50s. My abuela doesn't vote the same way that my cousin votes, for example, and Cubans in Miami don't necessarily vote the same as an Argentine family in Miami. When we talk about Florida, and I will say I'm guilty of doing this too, of writing stories that are focused on Latinos in Florida and really focusing a lot on Cubans. There's a huge population of Puerto Ricans in Florida, a huge population of Colombians, Venezuelans, Central Americans. There's a huge population of El Salvadorans in South Florida, for example. So it's really paying attention to that. When you're looking at these individual states, when you're looking at nationwide, there's no way to have this one cookie cutter, one size fits all for how Latinos are voting or what moves them to the polls.
So Sabrina, you brought up a really great topic about the segments in our community, right? Like the other myth. The myth is we're a monolith. We're not a monolith, right? Sabrina, you did a great job of sort of explaining all of the different kinds of folks and communities and countries of origin. We'll talk a little bit about also language and the choice of language. My question for you, Matt, to build on what Sabrina was telling us, one of the other myths that we have is that Latino voters make a difference in only a few key states. And I think you're a good example of the kind of work that you do that may not be true. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
No, that's a great question there. And one of the things that we have to realize as strategists is that when you're dealing with a demographic, when you're dealing with a group of voters that are very dynamic all across the board, you cannot look at it as in a silo. It is a conversation that you have to have with them on an ongoing basis. And so when you're looking at states like Texas, Florida, California, we have huge Hispanic population, Latino populations there where Republicans, Democrats were all trying to target. But it goes much, much further, because when you start to get into battleground states, when you start looking at swing congressional districts, if you have a demographic, a voter demographic that you can win in the margins, and a lot of these areas we've seen historic gains. As a Republican strategist, we have seen historic gains over the last 2 to 4 election cycles. These tactics and these demographics, the blocks of votes, matter immensely because it can make a difference. A margin voter is incredibly important when you're talking about 2 to 3%.
Matt, can you give me an example of where that may have played a role, just one or two, in the last couple of cycles?
Sure. I do a lot of work in Texas. It's not necessarily, we talk about states as being, heavily centered with different populations. But if you look at Will Hurd's district 2 cycles ago, that was a district where he should not have won. It was a bad cycle as a Republican. It was a bad cycle for anyone that their seat was not heavily in favor of that particular party that you're running in. But it made the difference because he went down, and it was not a broad target. It was door to door, face to face. It was in individual conversations. We had a couple of campaigns, one in Tennessee, as a matter of fact, 2 years ago, where it was third-party groups invested so heavily in order for the turnout of the Latino vote in that district. And we're not talking hundreds of thousands of voters. We're talking 4,000 to 5,000 that they were targeting.
So, Stephanie, Matt has brought up incredible tactics. Maybe not so incredible, they should be basic perhaps, but when they are put into practice and in a consistent level, maybe that's what makes it incredible. And Will Hurd, Texas 23, just for...
Formerly Texas 23, I think.
Correct, yes.
It's now a new...
That's changed, redistricting.
Yes, okay. So when we're talking, so Matt talked about these tactics. Tell us a little bit more, and also under this rubric of myth busting, and it's about communicating. How is it that we communicate with Latino voters, and what is the latest research that shows that we should be doing?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm so excited to be here this morning. I think we were supposed to do this panel a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when it was first canceled. So I'm glad to be back here, and I'm glad to see such a full room of people who are interested in learning about this electorate. When we did the pre-call, I think I actually told Matt, I may not actually disagree with you that much on this panel, even though you're a Republican and I'm Democrat, because I think there are a lot of things that we learned in 2020 about Donald Trump's campaign to reach and engage Latino voters that, again, challenged some of the conventional wisdom of what we thought were tactics that worked. And I'll talk specifically about tactics in a second, but I think one of the things that 2020 showed us was like all of the things that we believe to be true about Latino voters, that they're naturally Democratic base voters, that, more conservative voters are the people who have been here longer, like my family who's been here for 13 generations in New Mexico. And quite frankly, and that, this binary, as I think Democrats have been very lazy about seeing the Latino electorate in very binary terms. You're either Cuban or you're everybody else. And if you're in Florida, you're either Cuban or Puerto Rican, but the reality in Florida is the majority or the plurality of Hispanic voters are neither. It is the Latin American voter in Florida that played a really critical role in its swing. So it's Colombians and Mexicans and Salvadorans. And if you go to Florida and Miami, even in Miami, the bastion of kind of Cuban conservatism, you find Latin American voters everywhere. So that is something that needs to be well understood and contended with. And it was something where we at Equis saw the greatest swing and shift among voters in Florida were among those Latin American voters. The other thing I just want to raise from the L2 presentation is that while those forecasts seemed very optimistic, I would love to see that level of turnout. I think the three big takeaways from the 2020 election that's important to know is, one, we were the swingiest part of the electorate. If there is one true swing voter that still exists in the electorate, it is the Latino voter, and that should be your number one takeaway today, and that it is not a base voter. And we'll talk a little bit about the people who we saw move to Trump and why, some early kind of hypotheses about why we think they moved that way. The second is that we are the fastest growing part of the electorate alongside Asian American voters. And even though we saw increases in raw turnout, as those numbers pointed out, which are very, optimistic, 50% of eligible Latino voters still stayed home, still stayed on the sidelines. So like the population is growing so rapidly, we have to keep up with the population growth in order to continue driving out at the levels commensurate with our potential. And so as it relates to who we actually saw move toward Trump, again, challenging conventional wisdom, we saw that it wasn't necessarily the more conservative, what people might believe to be the more conservative, longer standing voter here in the US. It was actually a more newly immigrated, more newly arrived voter. It was not necessarily vote switching that we saw among new Trump voters, as we call them. It was actually surge voters. So it was people who had not voted in 2016 or in 2018, but for some reason or another, and what we would argue is that 2020 really became a referendum on the economy, where 2016 was a referendum on immigration, 2018 we were in the heat of family separation, it became a referendum on the issue of immigration, and I'm sure we'll touch on this because we're again in a moment, and we're here in Nevada, which has been a hotbed for this topic and for this issue for many years, including Senator Harry Reid's re-election in 2010, and the role that immigration can play as a issue that can really define candidates among Latino voters, and that Democrats shouldn't be afraid of it. Republicans can very much be vilified if they handle it poorly, and we Democrats should be putting more blame on Republicans for them not coming to the table on immigration. So I think there's a lot that we can be doing to talk about immigration and understand how immigration plays in the Latino community. As Sabrina and I were talking earlier, and I'll stop here in a second, clearly have a lot to say on this topic. I could filibuster for a long time here. But is that immigration is really a gateway issue for Latino voters. It is not, as the Latino voters are multi-issue voters. We are working class people. We are dealing with healthcare costs and access to education. I think in the same way Lionel Sosa, suggests that Latinos don't think they know they're conservative, they just don't know it yet. I think Latinos are progressive and they just don't know it. They want free community college. They want free access to health care. They want only to have to work one job, not three. So there are a number of issues that I think Latinos are predisposed to be progressives on, but again, immigration is that gateway issue to understand, do you think we should be here? Do you think we belong? Or do you think we're rapists and murderers and that we're not part of this country? And so I think you're seeing that play out kind of in real time, and there's a huge opportunity, again, if Democrats deliver on immigration right now, as Harry Reid kind of pointed out in the press over the last couple of days, that this is, again, an opportunity for Dems to deliver for Latino voters.
So if you could see my notes, you would see that all these myths have just erupted on my notes here. Thank you. But I want to focus in on a couple things that you said, Stephanie. 50% of our voting electorate does not vote. It's not the population, it is actually voters. And that may be for a variety of reasons. They're as simple as not being registered, or they are registered and they don't come out and vote, or they're simply not communicated with. And this is where I would love to bring you in, Sabrina, because Stephanie also mentioned surge voters, which was a big issue, of course, in 2020. But I also know that you've been covering the governor's election in Virginia. And full disclosure, our firm is doing the Latino outreach and communications for soon-to-be Governor McAuliffe, hopefully. So tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing in Virginia, and do you think that the results of 2020 are actually an energetic force that is, aside from whatever gaffes may be happening on the campaign trail, what do you see and what's your perspective on it?
I will start with saying my thesis on the governor's race in Virginia changes every day. So nobody here hold me to it.
We won't.
Depending on the results. We will see what happens ultimately. But I do think that many of the conversations that have come from 2020 results have been, I won't say productive, but to see those conversations happening in the first place is interesting. And as a Latina, as invested in these issues on a personal level, to see those conversations happening obviously is great to see. Now, will it translate into this? Has it translated into this election? Will it translate into 22 is a whole other question. One concern that I've seen in Virginia is the question of, have they arrived too late? Have they upped the engagement too late? Should they have been doing more radio ads a few months ago? Should they have been doing more events publicly? And this is for both candidates. I'm not talking about McAuliffe or Youngkin at this point. But the question of that outreach continues to be an issue for Democrats and Republicans. I think Republicans in the state have been quick to do micro-targeting in a way that probably wouldn't have happened pre-2020 necessarily. So we're talking about signs of Salvadorans for Youngkin or Peruvians for Youngkin, and we're seeing the Democratic side do that too, but we saw that in 2020 and we saw some of that in 2018 with Democrats there as well. So the reality is that Latino outreach has definitely improved. I mean, we see campaigns having, and McAuliffe is an example in that sense of having a Latino outreach director that's focused on this issue. And I wrote a story about the campaigns, and I think this is a great example and a personal example from just reporting it out, was the fact that both campaigns immediately called back. And both campaigns immediately wanted to talk about it and immediately had a one-pager to send of what their efforts looked like. And when Youngkin announced, he did an interview on Univision, and when McAuliffe announced. So the fact that they are even that quick to be responsive on this does tell me that people are paying attention to it. But I think that we will hear after the election some of those gripes of maybe we were too late, maybe we should have upped it, maybe we should have micro-targeted better, maybe we shouldn't have focused on Latinos in North Virginia, or not focused on them, but maybe focused on other areas of the state. I think some of those things we're going to be, we have to see how they shake out.
I can say right now it's yes to all of those things. So one of the things, again, I'm going to date myself, but I have worked on every governor's race in Virginia since 2001, so every 4 years in the off-year election. So I've lived in Virginia for a long time, and I know the state well, and I am so thrilled to hear that they called you back immediately from both sides, because that did not happen.
And multiple people, so this
Yes,
was not,
exactly.
It wasn't like one press assistant called
I think
back,
that's-
but it was multiple people on both campaigns.
Well,
what can we give you?
That's exactly right. And so this is about a different press operation, and you mentioned, Matt, about communications. Can you tell us a little more about what you're advising your campaigns in terms of communications? Because this is a great example that Sabrina has given us, that honestly, these entire teams did not exist literally 2-3 cycles ago. I know that Youngkin tweeted out in Spanish just a few days ago. In Spanish, I was like, wow, this is all new. And part of it is what, as consultants, what we advise the campaigns. Really, folks, is not what the end result is. We try, we push, we always ask for more money, Univision. We ask for more radio ads, we ask for digital, we ask for exciting, new ways, and inevitably choices need to be made, are made, and I find on the receiving end, I don't know what your experience has been, tell us what you think about communications and how it ends up as a consultant.
So typically when you're doing these campaigns, everything has a cost, and as a consultant, we go through these and frankly, it may not be a popular opinion, but we look for ways to monetize things on the campaign. Let's just be upfront about it. It's hard to monetize when you are trying to motivate a voting demographic that is very, very relational. Door-to-door campaigning is essential for the Latino community. An ongoing conversation. If you think back to what happened in 2012 with the presidential races, these ongoing conversations, they invested heavily in not just sending one person one time to somebody's door. It was an ongoing relationship that the Obama campaign developed. I remember I was working in Florida. We would get calls from people saying, hey, I've had this same person approach my door 5 different times. And so it is not a flash in the pan, but it's a very hard thing for campaigns to do. Additionally, you're dealing with so many nuances within a group. You have to ensure that whatever message you're communicating is effective. We saw historically, there are about 20 border counties in Texas that flipped from traditional Democrat, that flipped Republican, or broke a historic trend, closing that gap significantly. The Trump campaign lived on YouTube. They changed that message significantly almost every day, and it was effective, but it's costly. It takes a lot of time to make sure that you're communicating and ensuring that you're having a message that will seep in. One of the interesting facts about the last presidential race, and we're talking a lot in hindsight, but these are things that we can learn about how to effectively use it in 2022. But one of the interesting facts about the Republican surge within the Latino community is that the age demographic was 18 to 45-year-olds, a very, very young audience, particularly from a Republican standpoint in a general election. That's not typically our sweet spot. So what was happening within that group? I think there was a lot of different things. I have opinions. I'm sure you have strong opinions on it. But some of the issues were completely out of our control. If you think about defund the police, those border communities, law enforcement heavily employs the younger community down there. And so message matters when you're trying to do these things to motivate that margin in your race. But you cannot take it for granted. You have to be intensely focused on it, because we've seen campaigns that miss the mark all the time. They mistranslated something. They're trying to communicate to a Cuban community, but the translation was wrong within that. And so the nuances are incredibly important.
Yes, so Stephanie, communication tactics, new ideas,
Yeah.
and then we're going to dive into choice of language as well.
Yeah, I'm dying to talk about this. As you can see, I'm like jumping out of my seat here. So a few things I would just say. First of all, Matt, you're totally right on a number of different fronts. First, I would say is on the Democratic side, I think over the last, since basically 2016, there has been a fetishization with technology, scale, and minimal cost per vote. And I think those have been the wrong metrics for us to be focusing on these last 4 years. And it's forced us to really nibble at the margins, like to really kind of do marginal plays. I'm going to kind of state a couple of facts that just, I think, illustrate this really clearly. One is that in the last 30 days of the election, Democrats spent $14 million in South Florida media market alone on radio ads, period. Meanwhile, conservative aligned forces purchased Radio Caracol, which was one of the kind of last standing Spanish language radio stations in South Florida, for $350,000. So I know many of you do those radio ads. I'm not suggesting we don't do radio ads anymore, just to be clear. But what I'm suggesting is that we actually have to think about shifting into doing more infrastructure plays. What we're seeing on the right, also on YouTube, Donald Trump invested a ton on YouTube, and this is why. And I would argue, no disrespect to our sponsor, Univision, but Univision's number one competitor in the Hispanic market is YouTube. Latinos are watching and consuming news and information on YouTube. They're not just watching music videos. 70% from our latest postmortem poll of Latinos in battleground states, between 67 and 70% of Latinos are getting their news and information about politics and elections from YouTube. You know what the right has? OANN now has a Spanish language vertical. PragerU has a vertical targeting Hispanics with Hispanic validators. Donald Trump's number one performing video of his entire campaign, 35 million views. I just watched it before I came down, and probably 1 million of those views, because I'm obsessed with this video, is Jorge Masvidal, a UFC fighter, Latino guy, I believe he's Colombian or Venezuelan, talking about how Democrats cannot take the Latino vote for granted. 35 million views. That was not targeted at a Hispanic audience. It was the YouTube masthead, which means the Trump campaign invested in it as a targeted as a strategy to reach all voters, and they didn't care about the backlash. So that is just to say there's like a whole set of YouTube that like we are not even really thinking about and touching, and how we think about communicating with Latino voters where they actually are. We've spent a lot of time thinking about not just digital ads, which I would argue there is value to digital ads, but I think our current strategy right now as Democrats is to pelt voters with digital ads the last 30 days of an election, the last 60 days of an election, expect some like the magic digital ad to like persuade them and turn them in a way, when over the course of 2 years, there's been a steady drip of news and information shaping the way they see their world and themselves in it, and the way that they see politics. So we can't expect even the best 30-second digital ad to really compete with that year-round infrastructure. And I think that from a communications perspective is the number one tactic where Democrats are falling short right now.
And that's an incredible point, because it's about the disruption of our media, right? It's broadcast, it's radio, it's not just Facebook ads, honestly. Like Stephanie mentioned, there's a lot of different avenues there. But this also leads into choice of language. The other big myth that we have is that honestly, I get these assignments, and when they say Hispanic in a lot of Democratic campaigns, it's, Spanish language, fill in the blank, but it's only Spanish language. And I consistently have to explain how that is only getting one segment of the entire voting population. Sabrina, what do you think about, I know what you think. Share very quickly to others how this is so incorrect.
For the first question, that's definitely an area I should have touched on. When we're talking about the differences of Latinos socioeconomically, when we're talking about geography, when we're talking about that, language is another piece of this. And the relationship with language too, because there's plenty of Latinos that speak Spanish, but don't consume their news in Spanish. I raise my hand to that. So we're talking about finding ways to target this wide group of Latinos, not just Spanish speaking, not just Spanglish speaking, and not just English speaking Latinos. One area that I came across it a lot with last year was the stories that came about Spanish language disinformation. And I wrote one of those stories that was focused on how widespread it was targeting Latinos in South Florida. The story was focused on South Florida. It was definitely a larger trend nationwide, but something that upon retrospect, looking back on that story, thinking, there was so much English language disinformation also targeting Latino voters. This was not just a Spanish language phenomenon. And I think sometimes when you talk to consultants and talking to campaigns and talking to folks in the political world, it's like this abstract, like, oh, we have to do like the Spanish language ad, and then it's gonna be just a direct translation of that English ad that we had. That doesn't necessarily work. That doesn't necessarily translate. And I think having people on staff that have that cultural competency is incredibly important of, okay, what is the message that we want to translate in Spanish? Because it's not necessarily going to be the same as the message that you have in English. Not saying you're going to have two completely different messages in two different languages, but finding the way to tailor those things, and definitely having people on staff or hiring translators that actually speak Spanish, because it's also embarrassing the amount of campaign ads and the amount of digital ads and stuff that you see that don't have Spanish spelled properly or spoken properly.
We at Chambers Lopez, we don't translate, we adapt, and we think in Spanish when we write our copy, and then we back translate so that the lawyers can approve it, because none of the lawyers speak Spanish, right? And the other thing too is they always want us to include, 10 copy points, and I just have to explain over and over that Spanish is 30% longer than English, and I cannot expand time. I'm really, really good at what I do, but I cannot expand time. And so that is one of the tidbits. If you don't know, Spanish is 30% longer. They have to have 30% less copy in English if you want us to adapt it. So I wanted to, we're down here to last few minutes, but I wanted to touch on polling, and one of the myths that we have that I run into, and we can do this a couple of ways. I know I have pollster friends listening in right now. Either the myth is Latino polling is always right, or polling is always right when it comes to Latino voters. And so I want to talk a little bit, Matt, what's been your experience with pollsters about getting the right questions? That's the other thing too. Pollsters like to translate their questions from English to Spanish, and sometimes they don't make any sense culturally in Spanish. We understand what you're trying to get at, but they don't make sense. So that's also a key component that happens, and I do know that a lot of times a translator gets it the night before and it's in the field the next day. So what has been your experience with polling?
Well, just with any polling in general, it's often how you set up the instrument that you're about to go and use in whatever race or whatever project you're doing. And so investing that time on the front end, I have not had a bad experience with it, but what I will say is that I don't believe that on the Republican side, and even doing corporate work, I don't believe anybody has cracked that piece of it in order to effectively use polling in order to impact the campaigns. It's not an area where we have taken time to invest in. It's not an area where we have developed out, but we are getting better at it. We have seen leaps and bounds of improvement over the last several years. And so I think you're going to see in 2022 a significant effort, a significant time being put into that, and you should be able to see the rate of return and the dividends start to pay off. One of the other elements that I did also want to highlight when you are doing polling is it's not a stagnant instrument. You have to look at it and say, okay, this is our snapshot in time. How are we going to adjust that as the campaign grows and develops? And that's going to be an incredibly significant piece when you start getting down to the last 60 days of a race, in order to understand that you may have done this poll 3 months ago, but it might not be as effective in the last 45 days of the campaign as things change dramatically, particularly with my experience with the Latino vote is that they will tune in to the race much later. You are inundating them with information, but they'll make a choice much later. And so these are things that you have to really think through as you're trying to develop a voter contact strategy.
I'm glad you mentioned it's a snapshot in time. I was taught that a poll is dead on arrival. The minute it hits your desk, it's dated. Stephanie, what advice do you give to, you have an incredible polling team. I've worked with many of them. I like some more than others. And so what is your advice to pollsters to be able to gauge what Latino voters are interested in and what will motivate them? We haven't even talked about the energy, the lack of energy, mobilization, and energy to go and vote.
So many thoughts.
And we have short.
I know,
yes.
I only have 50 seconds or less. So a few things. First and foremost, part of why we started Equis Research 2 years ago, my co-founder Carlos Odio and I, Cuban American from Miami, I'm from New Mexico, and we have a team of people who make up like the Latino experience in the United States, so lots of different walks of life on our team. So we started Equis Research to be a resource consortium and hub to create a depth of understanding of the Latino electorate that could help inform better strategy and ultimately better outcomes with the Latino community. So a lot of our work is focused on polling. We've worked with Lorena on a set of digital tests and kind of new innovations around how to reach and engage Latino voters. But we really want to set the gold standard for Latino polling. We work with lots of different pollsters, GBAO, GSG, Maparetto, lots of folks.
And I love them all.
Yes, exactly. But the challenge is really, again, like as you think about, this is like, again, not something that you just simply translate and then go give to a pollster. It is a very methodical process. And so I think, the Latinos are not a monolith. That is something that, like, every time I hear that phrase, I roll my eyes and puke in my mouth a little bit because I'm just like, oh my God, really, again? But, like, I think the world is finally waking up to that. So welcome to the party, everybody. We're really excited to be here, to have you be here. And ultimately, like, understanding that whether it's a poll and the way we view our research and polls, it's about shaping narratives about Latino voters, but it's also creating actionable measures for campaigns and independent side entities to take so they can actually take our polling and put it into practice, because a poll is dead on arrival and it just sits on a shelf and it's lots of fun to navel gaze and prognosticate. Unless you can actually put that into practice, like, the poll to me is useless, right? And so that is really what we focus on, is again making that polling work actionable. So follow us at equisresearch.us or follow us on Twitter. We're about to release and get kind of our 2022 Battleground States polling up and running, which will kind of do deep dives in all of the states that are critical in 2022. We've got a lot of work on the postmortem from 2020 on our website that we welcome you all to kind of take a look in, dig deep. We want to be curious with you. We want to help you reach Latino voters better and more strategically, not necessarily more efficiently, because I think, like, that shouldn't be our goal necessarily. So look forward to working with all of you on that.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Sabrina and Matt to close us out. What is the one bit of advice to our consultants here when thinking about the Latino voters and the difference that there are across the country?
I think the number one thing is talk to Latinos. I think it's, talking amongst yourselves is not going to be the same as going out into communities, talking to people on the ground, whether that is the county Democratic chair, the county Republican chair, whether it's, a big organization on the ground. When you talk to those folks, you're going to get a much better idea of who it is you're dealing with, whether you're dealing in local races, state races, national. You'll have a much better sense. And I think reporters have to do the same too. So I think it's across the board of really going out and talking to people.
Terrific. Matt?
And for, just my perspective on it is you have to engage and engage early. This is not a group that it is, sometimes you have to start voter contact much earlier than you would on a traditional campaign, because it is very hard to have this message seep through because we're being inundated with content. And so it's part of this process of we may have to throw out the handbook of how we've traditionally run campaigns in order to motivate the Latino community.
Matt, Stephanie, Sabrina, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our wonderful guests today, and thank you to Univision.